we were sitting in this makeshift van, mortar fire, rocket fire, machine gun fire, all in the near distance. And day by day, week by week, it was failure after failure after failure after failure. But there was no failure of imagination. We really believed that we could get this system up and running, and after 6 grueling weeks, we were able to do it. And it ended up providing a capability to the troops on the ground that helped them take thousands and thousands of insurgents off the battlefield and save thousands and thousands of lives. And that, I talk about that point in my career as kind of the beginning of my love affair with technology and my obsession with the power of data and the reinforcement of the power of imagination to do hard things and solve hard problems.
When Armageddon is imminent, my guest on today's big interview is someone you want to have living next door. As director of the US Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, it was her job to keep America safe from attack both in the cyber and physical domains. Before coming to CISA, she was the global head of Morgan Stanley's cybersecurity division, navigating the bank's response to the COVID pandemic. A senior figure in the Bush, Obama and Biden administration, she's also a former combat veteran, conducting tours of the likes of Iraq, Afghanistan and Haiti. Jen Easterly describes herself as a proud mother, mental health champion, electric guitarist, and is rarely without a Rubik's Cube in her hand. I'm Emma Nelson, and my guest on today's big interview is Jen Easterly. Jen Easterly, thank you so much for joining us in the studio.
Great to be with you.
Let's go back to before you become Jen Easterly, let's start right at the beginning. You're born into a US Army, aren't you, situation. What was that like? What was your upbringing like?
Yeah. So the big influence on my life, well, both my parents, to be fair, but my dad, the experience in his life that I think really affected everything he did, affected everything I did, was his time in Vietnam. He was actually an illegitimate child back in the day in the 30s when that was a black mark. And so he was brought up by his Aunt Jenny and his grandmother Margaret, who I'm named for. And then when his mom ended up getting married, she married the local barber who treated my dad really badly, beat the hell out of him. And so he ended up dropping out of high school, went to join the Army. First station in Germany, and then went to Vietnam. And so you think about a very disaffected, highly intellectually curious, whatever he was, 18-year-old in Vietnam. Now, these were the early days in 62 to 63 before the violence really took hold. He was with the Army Security Agency in Tan Son Nhut Air Force Base. And it actually was a really positive experience for him. He fell in love with a beautiful French Vietnamese woman named Irene. That's not my mom. They didn't get married, but I think that was his first real love. And then when he came back, he ended up starting a fund to build an orphanage in Quy Nhon in Vietnam. It was called a program called Tender Tiger. And so he and I went back to Vietnam in 99 and traveled the country and visited the orphanage. And, he used to tell stories about it all the time. And it was one of the reasons why I wanted to be in the Army, why I ended up going to West Point, and, why we still talk a lot about service in the Army and why that was such an important point in his life.
You've said in the past that you're neither Democrat nor Republican, but you identify as an American. I mean, is that where your sense of patriotism and duty come from?
I mean, absolutely. I'm an independent. I've been an independent my entire life. I worked for George Bush. I was the senior policy advisor for Condi Rice. After 9/11, I was the senior director for counterterrorism for President Obama. And then, I worked in the Biden administration, but I've never been a political person. I've always been focused on security. The idea of America is important to me. It's one of the things that my father always talked about. Those who give up their lives for America don't do it for king and country or for emperor or for the motherland. They do it for the most profound idea in human history, and that's the idea that you're born free, and by virtue of your birth, you're entitled to liberty and justice. And that, to me, was always an incredibly powerful idea, and one that I've, spent most of my life protecting and defending.
At what point does this now decide your future within your identity in your career? When do you think, actually, I need to do this as a job, just as
I think in my teens, I wanted to serve, and so I applied early to West Point. I got in early. I made the big mistake of never visiting West Point because I was so sure I wanted to go there. So I showed up on a scorching hot day in 1986 in July, and I was terribly prepared. There was still a lot of hazing back then. Women were only 9% of West Point, and there were a lot of men, cadets and officers and staff that did not want women there. And so it was a bit of a shock at first. I wasn't prepared for the physical hazing, the emotional rigors, the sort of mental pressures, and it was really, really tough.
What did they do to you?
Well, I had one guy that realized I wore contact lenses, and so he would haze me when he had chewing tobacco in his mouth. So it would end up in my contact lenses, which would then start tearing up and stinging a bit, and he would make it clear that I was too weak to continue at West Point, which was very surprising to me coming from not that environment. But I think it made me more likely to stay in, to not quit. We had a lot of women quit. We had a lot of people quit. I think we ended up with, we started out with about 1,300 people in my class, ended up with less than 1,000. So there's a lot of ways where you cannot finish. But we lost a lot of women in the class, and I think it just steeled my resolve to have to deal with some of the really unacceptable behavior.
Why did West Point not lose you?
There was a time where I could have quit and gone home and gone to another school, but I'd never quit anything in my life. I didn't want to let my parents down. I didn't want to let myself down. And, every day I just said, I'm going to get through the next day and the next day and the next day. And all of a sudden, I'd gotten through my plebe year and, was into sophomore year, junior year, and it turned out to be a better experience towards the end than as it started. I got a chance to do different types of military training, airborne training, air assault training. I got to go off to the Air Force Academy and be an exchange cadet there and learn how to fly gliders, and got to spend a summer in Mons, Belgium, to be an intern at the Supreme Allied Command headquarters. And these were just fantastic opportunities for me that just confirmed that even though it was difficult from the beginning, I had made the right decision.
Then there follows, a 2 decades career inside the U.S. Army. Where does that take you?
Yeah. So 21 years in the Army. It started out right after I left West Point. I went to Oxford to do a second degree in philosophy, politics, and economics. So I did that for 2 years at Pembroke, then came back. And then after that, I went back to the Tactical Army. I went to the 25th Infantry Division, which is based in Schofield Barracks, Hawaii. As part of that time, I was deployed to Haiti with operation to essentially help Prime Minister Aristide, who had been ousted in a coup, to bring them back and do peacekeeping operations. And then after that, I went to Fort Bragg, which is the home of the airborne. So was a paratrooper there, a company commander, was stationed in Bosnia with Operation Joint Guard as the senior intelligence officer for Task Force Tiger that flew Apache helicopters and Black Hawks. We were focused on a mission strangely called PIFWIC, which was persons indicted for war crimes. So you'll remember Milosevic and Radovan Karadzic. So did that. And then once I finished my time as a paratrooper, I went to teach at West Point, taught economics at West Point as a young Army captain.
And that's when you are teaching economics. You're at West Point on the morning of September the 11th.
Yeah.
Talk us through that.
Yeah, I remember driving from my quarters to the economics department, and I remember remarking on what a beautiful day it was. It was just a beautiful, beautiful sky blue morning. And West Point itself, when the weather's nice, is particularly beautiful. And I just remember thinking that. And then I was in a meeting, and somebody came in and said, looks like a small plane has hit the World Trade Center, kind of strange, but so continued on the meeting. And then I was about to teach an economics class, and the second plane hit, and we knew that there was something serious going on. So classes were canceled. And, very soon it became clear that the world had entirely changed. Up until that point, if you go back and look at what the Bush administration had come in to do, actually the Army was going to shrink in size. And most of those cadets thought that they would be graduating into a largely peaceful world where they would spend a lot of time in training and exercising, but certainly not in combat. And the vast majority of the students that I taught did end up in Afghanistan or Iraq. Some of them lost their lives. And because of 9/11, I ended up going to D.C. to work for the Bush administration as the senior advisor for the National Security Advisor.
How does that come about?
Well, it's kind of a strange story. It didn't come about in a normal way. After 9/11, so September 11th, 2001. So 2001 was a intense year, but that wasn't really the defining event of the year for me. That was on the 4th of December, and that's when my little brother took his life. And I think there were a lot of reasons behind that, but because of that event, instead of going off to an operational assignment next, I went to D.C. to take care of my parents. And the West Point department, the Department of Social Sciences where I worked, was actually incredibly helpful to find a way to get me to D.C. to be around my parents. And so I got something called a Council on Foreign Relations International Affairs Fellowship, and it came together very quickly so I found a job, but I also was able to be with my parents as much as I could. So kind of came about in a way that was a bit unexpected, but ended up in a pretty intense time.
Explain a little bit more about what is then asked of you then when you have spent a good amount of time inside the Army talking about preparedness, talking about expecting that the world is going to be peaceful, and then two huge things happen to you both professionally and personally. Yeah. What was the shock like for that, given the fact that they are both wholly unexpected and equally devastating events?
I mean, the world was in a devastating place, as you know, at the time. And so I think I did the only thing that I could personally do based on, my history and who I was to focus on taking care of my parents, who had always been really important in my life, and focusing on the mission. And in many ways, it was just an amazing, amazing opportunity for me as a young Army major at that point in time to be in the West Wing, working directly for the Deputy National Security Advisor, Steve Hadley, and for the National Security Advisor, Condi Rice. This was summer of 2002 to summer of 2004. So this was after Afghanistan, the initial war in Afghanistan, preparation for the war in Iraq, the initial mission accomplished in the war in Iraq in 2003, and then when everything went downhill from there, after the bombing of the UN headquarters by Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, and then the beginning of the real violence. And then, so that was a very intense time. And then I was with Dr. Rice throughout the 9/11 Commission hearings, the preparation, and then when she testified. And that was a big sort of lightning bolt moment for me as well. But to see that as a relatively junior Army officer up front, how decisions were being made in just the crucible of the post-9/11 period, and then, taught me a lot, first of all, about national security decision-making, but it really emphasized to me the importance of service.
There's this photograph of you in the background where Condoleezza Rice is giving evidence to the commission hearing into 9/11, and you are an incredibly serious-looking woman. You've got your uniform on, and Condoleezza Rice and the team which is giving evidence talks about this failure of imagination. The fact that you had this failure of imagination, how bruising was that? And tell us what that meant.
Yeah. I mean, it didn't occur to me until I heard it, right? And so, but it has been the theme that I've carried with me throughout my life. And for anybody who has not read the 9/11 Commission report, you should read it. And what Tom Kane, who was the co-chairman, the vice chairman, what he said about, we were not prepared for the threat that had been gathering for some considerable amount of time. It was a failure of policy, a failure of management, failure of capability, but above all, a failure of imagination. Because if you go back and look at the history of the threats, we should have imagined that there was a capability like that to actually go after, weaponize our planes, go after the critical elements of our government. And that has, to me, I've carried that with me from my own deployments in Iraq and Afghanistan, in my own personal life, how I conduct myself, and really through everything that I've tried to do since that period of time.
This decision to carry on the imagination aspect of security carries you to 2006 when you're sent to Iraq, isn't it? That's an incredibly dynamic time for you, isn't it? Because you become, am I right in thinking that you stood up the US Army's first cyber battalion? So you're sent to Iraq not to engage in a kinetic war, but to shift your focus to cyber.
Yeah.
How does that come about? And tell us what that was like, trying to stop insurgents from entering the battlefield in real time.
So battalion came about after I redeployed from Iraq. Actually, in 2006, I was deployed to be what's called the chief of the Cryptologic Services Group. So the National Security Agency, the largest, the most powerful intelligence agency in the world. It's an interesting story because before 9/11, NSA was sort of no such agency. It was always behind the green door. Nobody ever really knew how to tap into these strategic level intelligence capabilities. And the head of NSA at the time was a guy called Keith Alexander, and the head of forces in Iraq was a guy called Dave Petraeus. Dave Petraeus and Keith Alexander were West Point classmates, and they were both close mentors of mine. And Alexander really wanted to be able to provide those NSA capabilities to the forces on the ground to help them make a difference. And so I was part of a mission to essentially build and operationalize a new high-tech platform. It was called Real-Time Regional Gateway, highly classified, top secret at the time, but it's since been declassified. And the idea was to take all the massive amounts of intelligence that were being collected about the bomb-making networks. You remember all of the improvised explosive devices. So information from satellites, from cell phones, from reporting from troops on the ground, and integrate that, correlate it, enrich it so we could illuminate terrorist networks, not in days and weeks when it was useless, but in hours and minutes, provide that to the troops on the ground so they could pursue and disrupt those terrorist networks. And the story that I talk about is we were sitting in this makeshift van, mortar fire, rocket fire, machine gun fire, all in the near distance. And day by day, week by week, it was failure after failure after failure after failure. But there was no failure of imagination. We really believed that we could get the system up and running. And after 6 grueling weeks, we were able to do it. And it ended up providing a capability to the troops on the ground that helped them take thousands and thousands of insurgents off the battlefield and save thousands and thousands of lives. And that, I talk about that point in my career as kind of the beginning of my love affair with technology and my obsession with the power of data and the reinforcement of the power of imagination to do hard things and solve hard problems.
Well, let's fast forward to 2021 when you are nominated Director of the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. We'll call it CISA if that's all right.
CISA, yeah. CISA. Rock on.
Completely unopposed, absolutely a shoo-in for the Biden administration. And you go in and it's at the moment when Biden is saying that actually cybersecurity is the core national security challenge. What's happening in 2021 when you sort of sit down at your desk, open up your laptop and go, right, here we go?
Yeah, well, there was just a series of things. SolarWinds became pretty famous for this massive Russian intelligence supply chain attack that impacted businesses worldwide, but many federal agencies. And that was discovered in December of 2020 when I was actually serving on the Biden-Harris transition team. I was still at Morgan Stanley at the time, and so I was seeing this as the global head of our Cybersecurity Fusion Center at Morgan Stanley, but then also seeing it as running the cyber policy team for the incoming president. But, that was the first thing that happened. Then you had a major Chinese intelligence attack on Microsoft systems. You had Colonial Pipeline, that was a Russian ransomware attack on a pipeline. You had other ransomware attacks against food services, against other software. And so all of this really highlighted the imperative for us to catalyze a new approach to how we were able to defend the nation, not just those federal networks, which CISA was directly responsible for, but all critical infrastructure. And, I came in as the second director of the agency after all of these attacks, after a pandemic, after a very contentious presidential election where my predecessor was fired by tweet by President Trump. And so, and there were 1,000 open vacancies. And so there was a lot to do both operationally to deal with a very complex, very dynamic cyber threat environment, but also to figure out how do you build an organization that gives you the capability and capacity to defend the nation in cyber.
And how did you go about building that?
Yeah, well, first and foremost, you have to do a little bit of one of the things that I had to do at West Point that I probably wouldn't have done if I went to a typical liberal arts school was a lot of engineering. I quite liked it, actually. So systems engineering, you're always trying to figure out like how do you analyze a way something works? And I had to do that for how do we hire people? So you almost had to do this reverse engineering of figuring out how to slay the bureaucratic dragons to hire people in a way that you could bring in the top talent, but bring them in more effectively, quicker. And so we were able to do that. We actually got new authorities to pay them more, closer to market, because we were competing with, huge private sector firms that paid hundreds of thousands of dollars. But at the end of the day, nobody comes to the federal government to make money, right? They come here for mission. And so the key thing for me was how do you build the culture, right? Peter Drucker famously said, culture eats strategy for breakfast. And so building the culture that would attract the best talent. So we work together on what are the core values, what are the core principles that are going to catalyze a foundational approach where people actually are excited about what they're doing. They wake up in the morning, they know they're going to make an impact on their mission. They like who they're working with. They feel empowered by their leaders. And so, we built a fantastic culture at CISA. We were ultimately able to hire 2,200 people. So when I left the agency, it was 10,000 total, but about 3,400 federal employees. And many of these were just incredibly top technical talent.
The job that you are undertaking, though, is enormous. It's almost unfathomable. It is. Just tell us a little bit more about this idea that on your shoulders lies America's infrastructure. How do you actually go about managing and indeed protecting a country where an awful lot of the infrastructure is run by the private sector for starters?
That's the key thing to think about. So CISA, look, at the end of the day, CISA's mission is to lead the national effort to understand, manage, and reduce risk to the critical infrastructure Americans rely on every hour of every day. When I see critical infrastructure, sometimes people's eyes glaze over because that's very technical. But no, it's water, it's power, it's healthcare, it's finance, it's transportation, it's communication. And as you're pointing out, Emma, the vast majority of those systems are owned and operated by the private sector. So we can play an important role as the government, and we certainly have valuable information from what we can see given our role in federal networks. But at the end of the day, the whole mission was how do you catalyze trusted partnerships with the private sector so we can all work together, share our visibility, share our awareness, and drive down risk to the nation. So, that was the other key thing I had to determine what to do. And part of the good thing of coming in when I did, there had been something called the Cyberspace Solarium Commission. In the government, we set up commissions all the time. I think the 9/11 Commission was a very important one. I also think the Cyberspace Solarium Commission was. And essentially, it was built to figure out what the U.S. Cyber strategy should be. There were a lot of recommendations that came out of it in 2020. One of them was to develop this entity called the Joint Cyber Planning Office, the JICPO. And that was...
There's an awful lot of acronyms here.
Yeah, it is. It's just terrible. It's death by acronyms. But it's also, Emma, JICPO. That's like the worst acronym ever. It sounds like a skin disease. And so I got this authority to set this thing up, which essentially was to build a platform where you brought together the entire federal government, so CISA, the intelligence community, NSA in particular, the FBI, U.S. Cyber Command, with the private sector on one platform to share visibility and information to plan and operate against the most serious threats. So not liking JICPO and loving rock music, we set up the Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative. I tried to call it the Advanced Cyber Defense Collaborative, but the lawyers did not let me.
How receptive was the Biden administration to you coming in saying we need to do this, and this? You identify the need did they respond and fulfill, your expectations quickly enough?
Well, I mean, the good news is, as the head of an operational agency, so sort of sub-cabinet level, I was part of the Department of Homeland Security, but because we had become a separate operational agency, I had a huge amount of autonomy. And there was a huge mission imperative to actually build a capability and capacity to defend the nation in cyber. So really, there were no roadblocks to me doing what I thought I needed to do. I mean, the roadblocks came from the enormous amount of threats, trying to deal with and to reduce any sort of bureaucratic impediments that existed. And then, to build and catalyze trust with the private sector. That was probably the major thing that I really focused on, to help people across the country understand. We were the newest agency in the federal government, and our name was really hard to say, and nobody knew who we were. So I had to spend a lot of time on the road meeting with industry partners, meeting with international partners, because of course we had relationships with over 150 foreign entities, meeting with state and local, meeting with election officials, because we were the lead government agency for election security. And so really making sure that we were adding value. That was the key thing, Emma. We can't be from the government and here to help. We have to actually add value based on what we know and what we can do.
You left when Donald Trump comes to power. How do you feel about the way that American cybersecurity is being managed at the moment?
Well, right now, and it's sort of 4 months in, what I have seen at CISA, and I've been very public about my concerns here, is there has been an exodus of some of the top technical talent, a lot of the folks that came on during my time. Some of them have been given early retirements. Some of them have left of their own to take other opportunities. I realize that the goal may be to try and streamline the so-called bureaucracy. But at the end of the day, we were a pretty lean and agile agency. When you talk about what you're getting for $3 billion, 3,400 employees, federal employees, and then all of our contractor folks, so about 10,000 total, you're getting a capability to defend the nation in cyberspace and to coordinate critical infrastructure security and resilience. So I worry about that exodus of talent really impacting the capability and capacity of America's cyber defense agency.
And what about the external influences which are reaching the highest levels? Do we know just how much information Elon Musk has harvested from inside Washington and what might happen? I mean, would that ever have happened under your watch, to allow the private sector to come in and start to really take deep dives into very, very sensitive places?
Yeah. I mean, I only know what I read in the news, frankly. But at the end of the day, what I worry about the most, Emma, is we had partners across industry. We had partners at the state and local level. We had international partners who were willing to share their information and their data with us because they trusted that we would protect it, right? Everything in CISA, we're a voluntary agency. We're not, they don't regulate. They're not law enforcement. They don't collect intel. They're not military. Everything is based on voluntary partnerships, and that is underpinned by one 5-letter word, and that is trust. And if you can't trust that your data is being protected, the model falls apart. So those are the concerns that I have. I have no idea what's happening now. My successor has been named, but has not yet gone through the Senate confirmation process. I am hopeful that when they have an actual confirmed director in there, they'll be able to chart a path forward so they can make sure that we can continue to have that trust.
Well, just looking at America at the moment, I mean, you talked about all the values when you were born and the values that you inherited from your family. How would you define being American in 2025?
It hasn't changed. I mean, America may be going through a little bit of a difficult time right now, but, in my view, you're talking to somebody who for nearly 35 years raised my right hand to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. I believe in the idea of America to my bones, right? I believe that America is the greatest country on the face of the earth. And I believe in the American people. And America has been through some very difficult times since it was born. But I believe in the goodness of America and the idea of America. And so I think we will get through the difficult times as we always have.
And that's all the time we have for today's edition of The Big Interview. It was produced by Chris Chermak and edited by Steph Chungu and Hunter Wang. From me, Emma Nelson, goodbye. Thank you very much for listening.